Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Beyond the README, where we're going to be talking about using the Ansible Debugger to simplify your playbook troubleshooting. We've all had the experience of running a playbook and having it fail, and then spending a lot of time rerunning that playbook with slightly different settings in an effort to correct a mistake inside of our task definitions. The Ansible Debugger greatly simplifies this process. It provides you with an interactive debugging shell that you can use to make changes, observe their impact, and then correct as needed on the fly. So let's jump right in and get started. The Ansible Debugger documentation is fairly helpful, but I'm going to hopefully provide you with some additional examples and walkthroughs in this video that will make it a bit easier to understand. So first, I'm going to start with a very simple playbook over here on the left. This playbook doesn't really do much. It just uses Ansible's built-in URI module to hit a web endpoint and then print a message. And the purpose of this message printing is just to ensure that the play is progressing normally and that we get to this task. What we'll see is that this first task will fail, and we're going to use the Ansible Debugger to resolve any failure scenarios that arise. So first, let me try running this playbook as is. You can see immediately that the task fails and that the playbook execution halts, and we have this error message that says unknown URL type. So if I was troubleshooting this without the debugger, I would make some changes to my playbook and rerun it. This often results in a time-consuming loop of making changes, seeing if they fix the issue, and then repeating as necessary. The Ansible Debugger makes this a lot easier. So first, we have to understand how we enable the Ansible Debugger. The Ansible Debugger can be enabled in a few ways. One of the easiest ways, if you're directly editing the playbook, is to add the debugger keyword. And the debugger keyword can be added to the play itself, to blocks, to tasks, anywhere you need it. So I could add the debugger up here, and tell Ansible to enable the debugger automatically if we hit a failed task. And there are a few different arguments to that debugger keyword as enumerated in the documentation. You can always invoke the debugger even if a task is successful. You can never invoke it. You can invoke it when a task fails or is unreachable or is skipped. There are a variety of options depending on what you're trying to troubleshoot and do with the debugger. So in this case, I've added the debugger keyword to the play, so any task that fails will trigger the debugger. I could also just as easily add the debugger to the single task that I'm trying to troubleshoot, and that will only trigger the debugger if this particular task fails. So let's go ahead and do that and rerun this playbook. Now we can see that our task has failed and we've dropped into this debugging shell. The Ansible documentation describes a number of different things that you can actually do with the debugger. You can print information about tasks, we can modify module arguments and task variables, we can update tasks, we can redo them, we can continue the playbook, or we can quit the debugger entirely. The debugging shell takes a little bit of skill and repetition to get used to. A couple of hints that I like to use: you can use Python's built-in dir command to print out the available objects in the current namespace, since this is effectively just a Python debugging shell. The built-in dir function will return a list of names in the current scope, or you can pass it an argument to return the list of names in that scope. So for example, if I pass dir task, you'll see it'll print out all of the different attributes and functions that exist on that task. The same is true with any other item. For example, if I execute dir on the host, you can see all of the attributes and functions on that host. Then I can print out the host variables by using host.vars, or I can pretty print these using the print command or the p command and specifying host.vars, which will print them in a slightly nicer formatting. But what we really want to do here is try to fix this task. So first, let's see what the error message is. If I redo the task with the r command, we can see that the error I'm getting is unknown URL type with the URL specified. So in this case, I know this problem is related to the lack of scheme, so HTTP or HTTPS, and I can update that accordingly. So we can print our task vars first, and we can see all the variables associated with this task. And one of those variables is the website that we define inside of the playbook, so we can actually update this. So I'll update that to include the scheme, and now if I reprint these task vars, you can see that the original variable is still present, but I also have this new website variable that's been defined on that task, and that's really all that matters for this case. We should now be able to rerun that task. So before rerunning the task, I like to run the u command or the update task command, and that will regenerate the task definition. It's explained in the documentation, but it will recreate the task from the original task data structure with any updated task variables. So now that that's been updated, we can try redoing the task, and now we can see it was successful. So now we can come over to our playbook and we can adjust this. So now I fixed the variable in my playbook. Let me go ahead and rerun it. And it looks like I'm still getting an error. Now I'm getting name or service not known. That's because there's a subtle typo in this URL. So we can see here that it's actually specified with 3 L's instead of 2. So I can go ahead and update that again, and just to make sure that it actually resolves the issue. And we can see that seems to have been the issue. So let me go ahead and remove that extra L. And now this should work just fine. Now, what happens if I had misspelled it in the updated task definition? So for example, let me go back to the way I had this playbook before and rerun it. We can see it failed. The first failure is regarding that unknown URL type. So let me go ahead and update this, and I'll include that typo. Now when rerunning the task, it fails with a different error, but you can see Ansible automatically drops back in the debugger, so we can iteratively resolve any issues that crop up in our playbook, which can save a lot of time. So now I can resolve the second issue, update the task, rerun the playbook, and see what my completed solution looks like. So I know I need to come over to my playbook and resolve both the missing HTTPS as well as the typo in the URL. So that shows how we can update task variables. Let's also see how we can update the task arguments themselves. So let's adjust this URI call to also specify a method, and I'll specify a post method. Now I know this web server isn't going to accept that post, so that should trigger a failure. And when I rerun my playbook, sure enough, I get back an HTTP 405 not allowed from that web endpoint. So first, let me start by printing out the task arguments. You can see we have the 2 arguments that were represented in the playbook, the method and the URL. Now I can go ahead and update those task arguments directly inside of the debugger instead of needing to jump back and forth between the playbook and rerunning the playbook. So I'll change this to a GET request, update the task, and then redo the task. And what you'll notice here is that it actually fails. And the reason for that is that when updating task arguments, you actually don't want to re-update the task. You don't want it to regenerate that task definition from the playbook definition. You simply want to update the argument and run redo, and now you can see it succeeds. So that's a very important difference between updating the arguments and the variables. When we change variables, it's a good idea to re-update the task. When we change arguments, we actually don't want to update the task. And so now we can see that the playbook was successful. So this is really excellent for troubleshooting issues with our playbooks, but you'll recall that one of the keywords we could specify to the debugger argument was the always keyword. In what scenarios would we always want to trigger the debugger? Well, here's a great example. Imagine you're writing a task and you want to register a variable. You want to use that registered variable later in your playbook, but first you need to understand the structure of the registered variable. You could, of course, look in the documentation for the return structure, but you can also trigger the debugger and inspect it. So let's look at an example. I'm going to just add another task here that checks for the existence of a file and then registers that result in the file_result variable. I want to use this file result later in my playbook, but I need to understand what it actually looks like. I can set the debugger to trigger always on this temporarily so that I can take a look at that data structure, because this task is going to be successful. It's not going to fail. So first, let me fix my URI task to use the proper method, and then I'm going to leave this debugger keyword off for a second just to see what happens. And you can see the playbook runs to completion, but I want to understand what this data structure looks like. And a common way to do this is to then print out the registered variable later in an Ansible Debug task. But instead, we can just drop directly into the debugger by enabling it on this particular task and rerunning the playbook. Now again, if we check for things in the current namespace using dir, we can see that one of those is the result. And the result actually can't be printed directly, it's just an object. But by printing out the result._result attribute, we can actually print out what the result of this task looks like. And this is what's going to be registered to a variable, everything except this invocation here. So now I have an idea of what this data structure is going to look like. So now over in my playbook, I can add a task that uses this data. For example, maybe I want to print the result and I want to print the size. Now I can quit my debugger, I'll remove this always keyword and rerun my playbook. And now you can see I get data back from that registered variable. So this really speeds up the amount of time it takes to work with registered variables, because instead of having to make mistakes and repeat yourself over and over, you can drop directly into the debugger, investigate the data structure, and then understand immediately how you need to use that data structure. So just to really drive this point home, let me go ahead and print out the entire file result, and I'll re-enable the debugger again. And we'll just rerun this one more time. Now we've dropped into the debugger because the keyword is set to always. I'll print out that result. I'm going to pretty print it using the P command. So this gives you the difference between pretty printing and just printing out the object as it exists. And so we can see this data structure. And now if I continue my playbook run, you'll see the playbook complete successfully. And now I'm printing out that entire data structure using one of Ansible's debug tasks. And you can see this is exactly the same as this result up here, with a few pieces of metadata removed, such as the underscore Ansible keys, as well as the invocation key. The last thing I'll touch on is enabling the Ansible debugger on playbooks that maybe you don't control. And I'm not going to show this, but I just want to point out that in the documentation, you can also enable a debugger in your Ansible config file or through an environment variable. And this can be handy if you're downloading a playbook that someone else has provided you with and you don't want to modify the playbook contents themselves. You can just enable the debugger inside of the Ansible config file or via an environment variable, and you can get all of the benefits of using the debugger, even if you're using someone else's playbook. So thank you for joining me on this brief episode of Beyond the README, where we took a look at using the Ansible debugger. Hopefully this knowledge of the debugger will make it easier and faster for you to develop your own playbooks. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your colleagues. I'd really appreciate it. I'll see you on the next one.